Hi everyone, this is Ali, welcoming you to the third episode of World of Warcraft Versus, my channel dedicated to fights to the death between characters from the Warcraft lore, which aims to decide which one would triumph. I'm from France and English is not my native language. Do not hesitate to correct any mistake or sound problems you might notice in the comments. This episode will feature the first members of the two main orders of Death Knights to have existed in Warcraft history, Arthas Menethil, the fallen Prince of Lordaeron, and Teron Gorefiend, the very first of the Death Knights and first stone on the paveway to the creation of the Scourge. Even if they are both of the same class, their abilities are wildly different, as they stem from two different sources and over works of two different masters, but their common feature is that they are, well, monsters. Unholy monsters of undeath who sowed disease and destruction upon their path, and were two of the most destructive war leaders of Azeroth. Even if they never met, I think it would prove interesting to compare their respective powers and confront the two orders of Death Knights created by the warlocks of the Shadow Moon clan. Note that we will consider Arthas as he was before he equipped the Helm of Damnation and became the Lich King himself, a terribly powerful Death Knight, but not the demigod he was after fusing with the spirit of Ner'zhul. Both will be used in their prime, which for Arthas is as he was when he confronted the leathery forces at the base of the Frozen Throne, without being boosted directly by the Lich King, and for Gorefiend during his last confrontation with the forces of Azeroth in the Black Temple, after his second resurrection, where he had ended up allying himself with Illidan Stormrage. Arthas and Teron are both the first of the two orders of Death Knights to have existed in Azeroth and Draenor, those of the Scourge, created by Ner'zhul, and those of the Old Horde, created by Gul'dan. They are both highly powerful, and even if they never met, the creation of one was foretelling the eventual rise of the other. With power that is similar in origin but quite different in practice, this should prove to be a very interesting fight. Whichever is the winner would sow death and despair upon the world anyway. We might as well watch the fight and decide, like Ner'zhul probably would, which of his champions is the most powerful.
To ask why we fight is to ask why the leaves fall. It is in their nature. Perhaps there is a better question.
Arthas and Teron will probably be confronted in an open field in the blighted glades of Lordaeron. Given most of Teron's allegiances, he might be traveling north in order to reach the Lich King and destroy the Frozen Throne, obeying Illidan or Kil'jaeden. Since he is oozing necromantic energy, Arthas would have easily detected this intruder, and waited for him on a hill to confront him as he had Illidan. Both knights would see the other from afar, the Dark Rider's silhouettes being easily recognizable. Both would have contempt for the other, and when Arthas would abruptly ask Teron why he was trespassing into his kingdom, the Orc would snidely remark that his own kingdom was death, and death is everywhere. Amused at this creature's mistakes for a mere necromancer in over his head, Arthas would draw Frostmourne and charge, intending to end it quickly. Using his hastening spell, Teron might have been able to flee the battlefield and escape the battle, but at this point, he doesn't fear Arthas at all, nor does he any human. He has no idea what he's facing yet, even if his opponent seems powerful. Gorefiend would simply hurl a series of hellfire balls at Arthas with his Trancheon, expecting to at least slow him down. However, Frostmourne's power is largely enough to counter such basic spells, and Arthas would cut through the missiles, reaching a surprised Gorefiend. The Orc would have the reflex to start fleeing, but would know he couldn't escape a strike, and would raise in unholy armor before parrying with his Trancheon. Arthas would directly feel the unnatural resistance around Gorefiend, and press harder, locking the two into place, attempting to crush his opponent by releasing a coat of ice on him. Teron would free himself from this attack by coating his weapon in unholy flame, effectively countering the cold. The standstill would break with Gorefiend backing down under Arthas' strength and fleeing on his horse, pursued by the human. Invincible is likely to be faster than Teron's mount, but the Death Knight would hasten himself to avoid Arthas and put distance between them. At this point, Teron's intention is to remain at long range in order to attack Arthas remotely, but the human being the pursuer, he would have the momentum necessary to be the first to cast a spell and try to stop his enemy. Arthas is not an idiot. He knows his enemy to be a necromancer, and by his knowledge of the Second War, he might know him to be a fellow Death Knight. The Lich King might even whisper the name Gorefiend in his ear. Arthas would thus remain careful and summon ghouls from under the ground of Lordaeron, grabbing at the hoofs of Teron's horse and rising from the earth to devour him. Now knowing he's facing a failed necromancer, Teron would smile, knowing himself to be the master of death, and would raise his own minions, taking hold of all the corpses he could find to fight Arthas' minions and stop his charge. Both Death Knights would summon all the undead they could, and a small-scale battle of rotten cadavers would ensue, separating the two combatants. Both Death Knights would use their tactical knowledge to try and defeat their foe, but wished to outmaneuver the other by encircling him and his troops, and both would do their best to empower their minions as much as they can, while keeping an eye on their formation and mentally wrestling for the undead souls of the opposing army. Arthas' unholy presence would strengthen and fasten all of his ghouls, and he could directly heal them, while Teron would be limited to augment the speed of his skeletons and absorb the energy maintaining Arthas' soldiers to thin their ranks. None would use their usual large fields of necromantic energy, knowing this would strengthen both sides. This would start as a dire battle, pushing their experience to the limit, but ultimately, just going on like this would end up being in the favor of Arthas, since his powers are better suited to group combat and he is a much more physical threat than Teron. The Orc would be the first to realize this, and would try to improvise with his old spells to turn the tide of the horrific undead melee. Summoning a bunch of gigantic spiders in the middle of battle to carve himself an empty space, Teron would lift his Tranquillon in the air and make it glow with green, fat energy, preparing himself to call an Infernal to his aid. Arthas knows of such spells. He'd wish to stop the warlock quickly by commanding his troops to push on right in front of him, to open up a path he could charge into to reach Gorefiend. Having to cleave through undistinct zombies and spider legs, Arthas couldn't reach his enemy in time, but his position would be sufficiently advanced to force Teron to cast a spell in the midst of his own undead troops. A hole would open in the sky, a green fiery meteor would be hurled from the nether, violently creating a crater right in front of Arthas, forced to stop his charge. A hulking monstrosity of rock and hellfire would rise up to face the champion of the Lich King, who would raise an eyebrow, smile, and start striking. The Infernal would be an actual challenge for Arthas, and one he could easily withstand, especially with an army of undeads around him. Unwilling to leave the result of the fight to chance, Teron would press on against his opponent by creating shadowy constructs from the souls of the fallen ghouls, sending ghastly minions to crush Arthas in the strength and number. However, the shadowy constructs are ghosts that Frostmourne would easily manage to absorb, and those reaching Arthas would barely hinder him. The remaining troops of Arthas that would not be fighting the Infernal would try to circle him and reach Gorefiend, but the Death Knight would consume them in a rain of fire without even looking at them. Defeating the Infernal would still be tough, and eventually, this hectic battle would buy Teron enough time to prepare and cast his most destructive spell, the Whirlwind, a tornado of Neverwind. Arthas would be caught in the midst of a storm, with no way of escaping. Swarms of ghouls and spiders would be turning around him, ripped apart, and even the Infernal would succumb and return to the state of mere rock. The human himself would likely have been killed, even with his augmented physiology, but Arthas would have survived the onslaught trying to destroy him by absorbing all the necromantic and life of his condemned soldiers to heal himself. Chunks of his skin would rip away from his face, only to be unnaturally regenerated a second later, leaving him subject to horrible pain. Invincible would do his best to keep his hoofs on the ground, but the wind would be too much, and both the king and his horse would be hurled away in the air by the storm, with Teron chuckling as he tortures this prideful human foe. Arthas would be enraged, Irritated that his opponent would ridicule him in this way, he escaped battling in the wind. The Death Knight would strive through pain and, observing the ground under him, would relax all but his resolve and let go of Invincible's reins. Now much lighter, his body would be violently hurled around at Teron's whim, and eventually the storm would dissipate, letting go of corpses, human and spider limbs, and heavy rocks from another world. In the midst of the debris, the king of Lordaeron would be falling like a dead wight to the full destruction of his body, for the pleasure of Gorefiend. However, at the last moment, Arthas would take a strange position to fall, facing the ground and pointing Frostmourne in front of him. The runes would glow, and Invincible would rematerialize under him, just in time to sprout a light pair of wings in order to slow his descent, enough for the pair to land safely. And right in front of the stunned Teron, the warlock would barely have time to leave his Trancheon, but Arthas would already be on him, striking. Gorefiend would barely be able to parry, and wouldn't have time to raise his unholy armor, which would result in him being shoved off his horse. With a flap of his dark wings, he would still try to evade Arthas, but to no avail. The triumphant king would cast chains of ice toward Gorefiend, enwrapping and putting him, and all that would be left to do would be to impale him on Frostmourne. Given the state of Teron's body, a strike to the heart isn't an injury as dangerous as usual, and the orc would try to crush Arthas's triumphant smirk by striking Invincible's legs with his Trancheon, but Frostmourne is no ordinary blade. Gorefiend would very vividly feel his soul being sucked into the cold runes, and Arthas would now be certain of his victory. The skeleton of a horse and a desiccated human corpse would crumble to the ground, leaving only a flaming ghost twitching on Frostmourne's tip. Arthas would be surprised. No soul had ever resisted for this long. Teron would be using all of his necromantic knowledge to manipulate the souls in the rune blade, trying to break the deadly trap from the inside by setting the energy ablaze. In the physical realm, the runes would glow brighter than ever before, and vibrate under the pressure of power, leaving Arthas very surprised. The conflict would be resolved inside the realm of Frostmourne, with the intervention of the Lich King himself, projecting his mind to subdue Gorefiend. Recognizing the spirit of Nazul, Teron would submit, understanding this to be in his best interest, on one condition. This battle would end up with Arthas planting Frostmourne back into the old corpse, which would be inhabited by the orc's soul once again. The Death Knight would rise, thanking his new master, looking at him with eyes filled with now icy blue. Arthas would formally dub him one of the 4 horsemen of the Scourge, making him swear to serve the Lich King in both life and death. Teron would swear, adding at the end, forever then. Thanks for watching this one. I like confronting characters from the same class. It can be easier to determine the winning factors, and I like how it shapes out their differences and respective traits. The more magical the fight is, the more complicated it becomes to clearly imagine, but it also gets very interesting. Do tell me if you have a request for a particular duel on the channel. The next video will be a little peculiar, as it won't function like normal WoW versus videos. It's gonna be something a little bit different. What I can tell you is that it will feature full-on warriors, Anduin Lothar, the mythical founding figure of the Alliance, and Orgrim Doomhammer, Thrall's mentor and the initiator of the Horde as we know it, in a recreation of a fateful battle in Blackrock Mountain. Subscribe to be updated when the video comes out, ask me any question you want, but for now, Alice signing out.